Chris?
All right. My name is Chris Cutrone, and I'm representing Platypus at this forum that we've organized. Here at the School of the Art Institute, I teach Marxian critical social and aesthetic theory, mostly through the works of Benjamin and Adorno, and I'm also one of the lead organizers of Platypus. When we in Platypus conceived the topic of this forum on resistance in the left, we had in mind the title of a pamphlet written over 100 years ago by the brilliant Marxist radical Rosa Luxemburg, titled Reform or Revolution, which sought to argue for the necessity of revolutionary politics on the left, not against reforms, but against a reformist perspective that was developing on the Marxist left at the time, in which it was regarded that only reforms were possible, and hence the political and social revolution was not only unnecessary and unlikely, but undesirable as well. We in Platypus seek to respond in the present to the development of the perspective on the left that assumes that only resistance is possible. We find this to be a symptom of the degradation and degeneration of the left over at least the past generation, over the last 40 years since the 1960s New Left, and indeed for much longer than that. We find the current self-understanding of the left as resistance to express despair not only at prospects for revolutionary transformation, but also at substantial institutional reforms. Platypus, as a project, seeks to develop a critical consciousness of the history of the left, which we think is necessary for the possibility of emancipatory politics both today and in the future. We understand the last 20th century as one of the history of the defeat and decline of the left, just as the 19th century was of the left's emergence and rise. We consider how we might suffer from a more obtuse grasp, a less acute consciousness of socially emancipatory politics than those on the left that came before us were able to achieve. In Rosa Luxemburg's phrase from the early 20th century, the world in crisis faced the choice of socialism or barbarism, but socialism was not achieved, and so we consider that perhaps the present is the descendant and inheritor of barbarism, including on the left. So we seek to reopen the question and problem of anti-capitalist politics at the most fundamental levels, asking what it means to struggle against and seek to move beyond capitalism, and what makes this possible and desirable. This is what the name and the works of Marx signify to us. Marx, as a thinker in the 19th century, did not invent anti-capitalist politics or socialism, but rather sought to understand the significance of left politics in light of history. Marx saw himself, and we regard him principally, in his capacity of offering a critique of the left, understanding its assumptions and aspirations in light of the historical development of possibilities, and thus seeking to push these possibilities further through seeking to understand how the left pointed beyond itself. For instance, we follow Marx as a critic of the left to the extent that we find that the conception of emancipation remains inadequate if understood as deriving primarily from struggles against exploitation and oppression. Rather, following Marx and his liberal predecessors, we seek to specify the freedom problem expressed in the history of capitalist society, to clarify how capitalism is bound up with changes in the character of free humanity. We find the true significance and meaning of anti-capitalist politics in its expression of how capital itself is the product of and continually creates possibilities for its own self-transformation and self-overcoming. Modern categories of emancipatory social struggles should be understood as part and parcel of capital and how it might point beyond itself to its own transformation and self-abolition. We find evidence of failure to grasp capital in this double-sided sense to the extent that the very conception of emancipation as the freedom and becoming of the new rather than the freeing of the priorly existent to be virtually tabooed on the left today. The left today almost never speaks of freedom or emancipation, but only of resistance to the dynamics of change associated with capital and its transformations. The spirit of Marx's observation that in bourgeois society under capital, all that is solid melts into air, has been displaced by his other famous observation from the Communist Manifesto that history is the history of class struggle. But even this observation has been debased to the sense of the perennial suffering of the oppressed, taking the subaltern in their alterity and not, as Marx meant in his notion of the proletariat, in the figuration of the new, and the new not as an end in itself, but as opening yet onto further possibilities. Stephen already mentioned the crucial distinction Marx made between reactionary and progressive responses to capitalism. I'd like to underscore that and say that Marx really made a point of departure from contemporaries who were more famous than him, like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the coiner of the term anarchism. in that he was really interested in how capitalism pointed beyond itself in a progressive manner, rather than the way you saw Proudhon as defending the artisanal working class that was threatened by the development of industry.
1 minute.
With the reconsideration of Marx and Marxian critical theory that we in Platypus are embarked upon, must come, to our mind, the reconsideration of the meaning of the history of subsequent Marxism, in other words, Marxism in the 20th century. But this means treating the tradition of the revolutionary Marxist left of the turn of the 19th and 20th century and of the early 20th century, especially of its best and most effective exponents, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, not in terms of what this left actually accomplished, which was, from the standpoint of emancipation, minimal and quickly stifled and undone, but rather what the historical revolutionary Marxist left strived for but failed to achieve. Platypus seeks to reconsider the legacy of Marxist politics in order to understand our present as being conditioned and haunted by its failure, so that we can marshal this suppressed and buried history, its unfulfilled emancipatory potential, to the service of the critique and attempt to overcome the most fundamental assumptions of the present, including and especially those on the left. Thanks.